Hey you guys, this is Miss B, and this is our very first writing workshop. Today's workshop will be on critical reading of college level texts, and I think it's a really good introductory workshop just to get us started, just to get an idea of what a class like this entails. And I think critical reading is such an important part of the reading process, and the reading process obviously is also an important part of the writing process, so it goes hand in hand. So a good way to begin is to clarify what I mean by critical reading. There are three kinds of readings. So first of all, we read for pleasure, which is for fun. We're not really looking for anything deep. We're just reading to entertain ourselves. We read for information. This usually means the type of reading where you're looking for something like the definition of a word or the history behind an event. So you might want to be, looking at an encyclopedia or a dictionary for that kind of reading. And number three is critical reading. Critical reading is really difficult. So this is the kind of reading we do when we are analyzing, when we are looking beneath the surface, when we are looking for connections and for deeper meanings. It's not something that comes naturally, although our brains are capable of critical reading, but the way that we get better at it is by practicing. So I came up with 10 steps that will make for a good critical reader. These are just my 10 steps. It's what I follow and it's what I teach my students. So let's follow along. Step 1. This is important. Annotate your reading. So here's my advice. Whenever I give you an article or an essay or a YouTube video or a podcast, any kind of source, I would like you to take notes on it. Now, how will I be able to see that you're taking notes? I won't, but at the same time, that's how you retain information. You take notes. So I have an example here on the right of a student who took notes. This is a poetry annotation. And notice the student, not only did she color code the notes, but she has all kinds of notes. First of all, she defined certain words like the word trodden. Here's the definition up here. This will help the student understand certain language that might be hard. The student also interpreted certain meanings, like over here what the title seems to suggest. The student also has opinions and reactions to the poem, like there's a huh up here, which is just funny because it's just the student not understanding maybe what the author is trying to say. There's a wow right here and an opinion that follows. There's even an amen at the end, which is so great because obviously the student is mapping out everything that she is thinking and feeling as she's reading the poem. And that's what I recommend you guys do as well. What I would do is just like maybe on a separate sheet of paper, take notes, maybe identify paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and write down your notes. This is such an important process. So you could write down your impressions of the essay, maybe some notes on the author's style, like is the author being sarcastic or humorous or serious? Maybe you could write down some key words that the author uses, and just any other responses that will help you remember the text. And that's ultimately the goal, to remember the text after you're done reading it. Step 2 is to read actively, and this basically means to always look for the author's main point. So what's the main point? That's the thesis. So we are going to have a thesis workshop very soon. But before we do, let me just, give you an overview of what a thesis is. It's a claim and a rationale. I'm always going to ask you to come up with a thesis. Your thesis is supposed to have a claim, which is your opinion, stance, or position in an argument, and a rationale. That's your reasoning and your explanation. It's never enough to just have a claim. You should also have a reason behind the position that you're taking. Here's an example. This is a claim. We should abolish the Electoral College. Okay, that's not enough. To have a complete thesis, you also need reasons for your position. So here is the full thesis. We should abolish the Electoral College to create more fairness and accuracy in the voting process. So this idea of fairness and this idea of accuracy are my two rationales in my thesis. And we will practice this more when we do the thesis workshop, but I did want to let you know that when you are reading another person's work, you should be reading actively, and what this means is you should be looking for the main point. As soon as you find the main point of the author, then you can determine whether or not you agree with it. Step 3, this is an important step, and you should be doing this for everything that you read. Understand the context. And this context means understanding who the author is, but also understanding the subject matter. So I put an example below, which we will read together. But in order to do a good job on understanding the context, you might want to answer these questions. Who, what, when, where, and sometimes on certain occasions, why and how. So I wanted to give you an example from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. This is just his introduction. I didn't include the full letter. So let's read this together. And notice, if you haven't read this document, there are going to be parts of it that are confusing for you. He writes, "My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms." And then, of course, he goes on with the rest of his essay. But why I wanted to use this document is to map out the context. Here we go. The who. Who is writing this letter and who is he writing to? So first of all, this letter is from Martin Luther King Jr., and he is writing to a group of white religious leaders. These are men who are criticizing him and his peaceful protests. And that leads to the what of the letter. He is writing in response to these men. And these men were very vocal about King's protests because they called it unwise and untimely. And so King wants to address that counter argument. When? This is happening April 16, 1963, where he's actually writing from Birmingham, Alabama, which you can see from the title of the work, but he's also literally in a prison cell. So he is composing this letter while in prison. And then, of course, the why and the how is super important here because this is probably considered, if not the most important, but one of the most important documents during the civil rights era. So notice, you guys, that the context is important because it helps you understand what King is writing about, who King is, and basically the background information. But it also, if you were going to write an essay about this document, it's going to help your readers understand what's going on in this essay, what the conversation is about, and who the writer is. And this is important every single time you are using a source. Step 4, understand what you read. By this, what I mean is look it up. Look it up in a dictionary, look it up in an encyclopedia. If there's a certain date that you don't know, look it up. If there's a certain word you don't know, look it up. And you know, this is a good practice. I had a teacher once who had us do this. She actually had us summarize the work after we were done reading it, and we couldn't look at it anymore. Like, we had to summarize it from memory. And this is a good test to know if you understood what you read. So I thought I would give you guys Sonnet 130 just as a demonstration. And when you read this poem, which you can do on your own, maybe you can press pause and read it first, you'll notice that there's a lot of words in this poem that we don't really use today. For example, the word done. We don't really use this word that often. Now, William Shakespeare's English is considered modern English, but at the same time, it's not the contemporary English that you and I use on a daily basis. So the word done might throw us off. So he writes on the third line, if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. If you look it up in the dictionary, done means tanned. So it is the opposite of white. It is dark. And then, of course, we come to the line damasked. I have seen roses damasked red and white. Now, damasked means intertwined. So when you put the red next to the white, it creates a contrast. And I suddenly understand that what Shakespeare is trying to say is, I don't really see that contrast in my mistress's cheeks, as in she doesn't have color in her cheeks. And then the word treads, well, that just means a type of stomping. It's like a hard type of walking. And he writes this when he says, my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. Now, what treads? Horses, donkeys. It's not an elegant kind of walking. So if Shakespeare's saying, my mistress is treading, he's trying to say she is not walking like a goddess. She kind of has like a rough sort of walk. And ultimately, this leads to my summary that William Shakespeare is trying to pinpoint his mistress's imperfections, but at the same time, he's trying to tell her that he loves her despite her imperfections, but also because of her imperfections. It is her imperfections that allow him to love her even more. That is really romantic. I don't know about you guys, but that's super sweet. And the only way that you can understand it is by reading it carefully and making sure you fully understand the words, the phrases, and the references that Shakespeare makes. All right, before we are going to do our first practice after step 5, but step 5 is to recognize counter arguments. We are also going to practice this. Now, counter arguments are the opposing side of your position. So what does that mean? I have my side, I have my position. The counter argument is the opposing side. Now, why would we use an opposing side? Because we create a better informed argument that way. If we write without really referring to a counter argument, it's as though we're writing in a bubble. We always have to think that we have an opponent that we're arguing against. So that's why I put this picture here, because you see the opponent, you go back and forth. So my opponent, whatever they say, is called the counter argument. Whatever I say in response to my opponent is called the rebuttal. And I put a little example here. These are phrases that you can definitely use if you want to practice counter arguments. All right, you guys, we are ready for practice number 1. I would like you to choose steps 1 through 5, just one of these that we went over. So, it could be, let's say, step 3, and create your own practice. I have the instructions here. I would recommend that you do this on like a Google Docs form. If you're going to, let's say, choose step 3, go ahead on Google Docs, write practice number 1. Underneath it, write step number 3, and follow these instructions and go ahead and do the work. I'm looking for, maybe like a paragraph of your work. Make sure to take your time on it. If you need to revisit the slides, please do so before we move on.